On this episode of the Eager to Know re-release series, we are talking with April Hall from the Rialto Report. The Rialto Report is a documentary archive of adult films, and one of the big things they have is a podcast. And April and Ashley host this podcast. I still listen to it 6 years later. It is really interesting. April is wonderful. She is an incredible interviewer. I mean, she turned the tables on this episode and started interviewing me, which I was not surprised. Her and I actually worked together years ago in a completely different industry. We worked in like the internet consulting industry. And I remember her telling me that she was working on this project. At the time, it was going to be a documentary, I believe, about the adult film industry. And I was so curious. I remember I was just very curious and asking her questions about it. So it was so interesting that years later, I became a fan of her podcast, of their podcast. And then I got to sit down and ask her all kinds of questions. So please enjoy this, and please check out their website and their podcast. The website is therialtoreport.com, and of course, the podcast is the Rialto Report. And please enjoy this episode. Thank you. So tell me about which of your podcast episodes that you like.
Oh God, like who's my favorite baby? That's so
Yeah.
bad. Yeah, I mean, I think they're different formats. So while I love the one-on-one interviews because, I like any kind of extended, deep, personal connection with somebody and conversation with somebody, the ones I think I love the most are more the story crafts where we're almost narrating a multi-layer story.
Yes.
So those really appeal to me in terms of making them. I don't know from a listener perspective what other people would think, but in terms of the production, that's probably the most satisfying.
Yeah, so some of them, I can see how there definitely is many different flavors, but those are
Yeah.
kind of two distinct flavors. One of them is the story arc, which that definitely sounds interesting. And then some of them, it sounds like I'm listening into a psychiatrist session. It really
Those must be
does.
mine. Like everybody
Uh,
always jokes because it's Ashley and myself, and he has like every detail of the industry, every background, knows everybody and stuff. And I'm like, how did that make you feel? So people
totally.
always joke with me because that's, what interests me is not so much the sex industry, although it's fascinating as an industry, and because of its nature, it sort of attracts unique stories, but it's just the humanness of it,
Yeah.
and the vulnerability of it. So that's, like any great story, if you can get to that layer of human, I think that's what gets me going by far.
Yeah. So I've been listening to these for the past 2 weeks, and I've been telling everyone about them and telling everyone that they need to listen to this podcast because I really enjoy it. So I'm just going to go down to tell you all the ones I've listened to. Christy
Uh,
Canyon, Kelly Richards, who's from Boston, and I love her accent.
yes, I know, right?
Lynn LeMay, Seika, Leslie Winston, which I just listened to. The Jerry Butler. I think there was Helga. Andrea True. I had no idea that Andrea True was the singer of that song from the
Oh,
70s.
really?
No, I had no idea.
It's so funny because I think even back in the day, well, they tried to keep it distance, but mostly everybody knew, so it was part of its appeal, But so interesting. So you've listened mostly to, I mean, Andrea True's a little bit different, but like more of the one-on-one stories, it sounds like, versus the crafted narratives.
Yes. So I feel like, yeah, I think so. And I don't even know how I've picked. I don't even know how I've decided which ones to pick. I think I tend to like the females better. I think that's more interesting to me. Listening to a female speak about her, being in the porn industry as opposed to the men.
I'm curious.
Why?
Yeah.
I think it's because of my view on sexuality, like, because I grew up with four older sisters, and
Mhm.
I don't know, I think my view on women and sex is like very
like old school. Like I'm like shocked that women like sex type of thing. And plus being a gay man, like
I
I
was
don't
just gonna say,
you
spoken
know
like a true gay man. Yeah.
absolutely. So this is totally true. And I have to tell you that I watched some straight porn in the researching for this. I hadn't watched straight porn since college. So, and even that, it was a bit because I watched gay porn, but watching straight porn, it was a bit jarring. Like, oh my gosh, like women are doing this. So it really like brought up all sorts of stuff for me. That's kind of interesting. So, what's your reaction to that statement from me?
Well, I think, well, like my question was more, did you watch contemporary straight porn or did you watch 1970s straight porn?
It was like I was basically looking after I would listen to someone that you interviewed. Then I would I want to see this person performing, and it was so I would like go on whatever Pornhub, and it was very jarring. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe like she's doing that type of thing. Isn't that funny?
It is funny. Well, it's also I think Ashley and I always say this that it's not porn that interests us so much as it's porn plus time. For me it's the fact that I'm talking to people, 35, 40 years after the fact. Some of them have grandkids, they've gone on to do all kinds of things, and a lot are like, why are you asking me about my summer job 35 years ago? Like, it's weird. And that's what's fascinating to me. So I picked up on that when you were describing it straight away, because we're looking back at people in a moment of time. And that's what I love about interviewing them now. It's sort of I think the hardest part of what we do is trying to crack through the narrative. So everybody, constructs their own narrative. That's not just for porn, right? Like if I asked you on an interview, you'd be like, I'm Ricky, I'm the artist, and you would sort of start that way. And it's hard to get underneath that
Yeah.
because it's the way we sort of enter into the world. And so I think that's what, I certainly try to do. Because it's a very, I mean, it probably pays to go back to kind of understand how we got to the podcast in a way, but like it's usually built on relationships. It's not very often that we are interviewing somebody cold
Okay.
and they haven't talked to us yet.
Yes.
So, I think basically when my husband and I have been married about a little over 15 years, and he had just come to New York and was interested in telling stories outside of his day job, and was interested in New York because he had grown up, he's English but he grew up in Italy, and had seen Taxi Driver and all these things. It was like, great, New York's going to be awesome. And then he comes here in the 2000s and it's like, what is
Hmm.
this place? And felt like he'd come to the party after everybody left, sort of thing. So we started by wanting to make stories about New York as like a symbol of change. Like, why was he having that reaction? And so we, kind of talked about a few things, and we narrowed on Times Square as a symbol of change. And when you go to Times Square, you quickly get to the sex industry. And so for a long time, we did video interviews of people. We've interviewed hundreds of people, and we actually rough cut a documentary. And then we said to ourselves, in order to um, build an audience for this film, let's start a podcast. And we also just were really falling in love with the medium of podcasts
Yeah.
because it's long form, like a film that we were going to do, it's going to be a couple of hours to just tell a story. Like any one person, if you do a collective, is going to be, a few minutes or
Yeah.
whatever. It's like,
Yep.
whereas obviously in a podcast setting, you're getting, to really get underneath somebody and what they do. So anyway, so a lot of these people that we've wound up interviewing, like we've known them for many years. I mean, different levels of, intimacy in those relationships, but it's always a help, when, especially I think it's a weird industry because people, especially back in the day, felt sort of taken advantage of in some ways, meaning financially, even though it was a lot of money for them at the time, they saw that over the years, people who distributed their films went on to make so much money off of those films and they never saw any of it. And so there's this consciousness of, kind of being taken advantage of for what you have to offer. So I think as soon as people understand we don't do it for any kind of commercial gain or anything like that, and that we're not getting on there and being like, hey, what's the best sex you ever had?
Yeah.
And like, we're not too interested in that. It becomes it usually kind of brings down the barriers.
Yeah.
Anyway, I
yeah.
will take a breath.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you. So it sounds like Times Square sounded like a focal point, and then from there, of your interest, and then from there you realize that the sex industry was a big part of that. Is that what drove you to the subject matter of the podcast, or was it like how did the subject matter of adult films become the focus? Is that something that you two were interested in, or was it something that was revealed to you as you started exploring Times Square?
Yeah, I mean, it's so Ashley, who grew up in Italy, when he was a young boy, the local cinemas used to play these sort of sexploitation, exploitation, and eventually even hardcore films. And so at a very impressionable age, as you might imagine, when the hormones are starting to course in, he was seeing this people. And aside from the fact that it was titillating to him as a young guy, I think he was just like, who are these people? You know, he's like in kind of Madonna whore Italy, and he's watching, these people having sex on screen and being like, oh my God. So he'd always had a fascination with the subject matter. And I think, for me, it wasn't so much like, oh my God, I have to understand adult film. But I think the reason when we talked about Times Square, and I knew he had that background. We talked about it because once you start talking Times Square, you talk about the films and stuff. And I think for me, my views on sex have always been very open, meaning like, everybody like do what you want and have a good time as long as nobody's getting taken advantage of. Like go for it. And I always have been uncomfortable with sort of the prurient nature of the states and how judgmental people are and stuff. So I think my interest was in exposing sort of these people as people,
And you've done that. You have done that.
Trying to just be like, these aren't just people who fuck on camera, right? These are people,
Yeah.
So I think that sort of his background plus my like sparked interest in that. But like we don't sit around and watch porn. I feel like it's like we read Playboy for the articles. We kind of do.
Yeah.
It's really ridiculous. Like we're so boring, like we're just like we don't like everybody's always disappointed by us. We are the vessels. That's all.
So that's one thing that I noticed was everyone is so different in these interviews, because I think I probably had a preconceived idea of what someone who got into porn, what they would be like in terms of personality or whatever. Everyone's different. Like, and everyone's personality is different. Everyone's background is different. Everyone's experience in the industry is different. Some of the people, it was kind of a rough, although not that many, some of them had a tough experience. Most of them, it seemed, had a really good experience.
Yeah, I think that definitely surprised me. I didn't expect it to be one size fits all, like, oh, all the girls are abused and all, whatever. But I think I thought I would hear more negative, or more regret from people.
Yeah.
And even as we've talked to them over time, like, because you could imagine, okay, maybe at first you get a sort of superficial, I'm
Right.
fine. No, it's
Right.
fine. I don't regret it. And then you get underneath a little bit and they're kind of like, I do. We definitely had some people who were like, listen, I'm not like deeply ashamed and traumatized by it, but if I look back, I sort of expected more for myself, and why did I do that? But most people were like, listen, like I think some of the themes, especially to your point on the female side, because like I feel like as women, it's it's so much more constrained sexually, right? Men are given so much more license, and
Completely.
women are, kind of put in a box, I think. And so what always appeals to me is when we talk to women who got into the business and said, like, I was able to kind of rediscover, take ownership of my sexuality through the films. Like, that's a theme that's come up a bunch that makes me go like, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. A couple things related to that. I mean, one of them was many of the women spoke that they didn't necessarily feel that attractive, or they had body issues. But then when they saw themselves, or they were engaging in making these movies, they were like, wow, I actually am really sexy. And
Yeah.
and I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even the one thing I do remember being so like in the I'm trying to think. I probably it would have been the very early 80s when I saw some pornography, and I think the first thing I saw was Sharon Mitchell. I don't know if you know who she is, but
No.
she's very androgynous, like flat chest, did like tomboy kind of thing, and I was like, that's what a porn star looks like, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever that it wasn't, when you think about porn today, well, I feel like it's sort of gone over a curve. So it's like if I think about the late 80s or 90s, I think it, especially if you think about strip clubs where it's like everyone had the boob jobs, everybody was hairless, everybody was a certain way, like it felt like there was a period where things were conforming a little bit more.
Okay.
But now with internet porn, I mean, I don't watch it a lot, but like my sense is it opens up a niche for everybody.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, you can get any shape, size, or whatever, and that to me is like I like that personally. The idea of like it widens acceptance of difference.
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about porn today if you could, but I want to go back to the golden age of porn, which is what your content is focused on. So it's the 60s, 70s, and 80s is what you guys are categorizing as the golden age. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's sort of that's roughly it. I mean, there's some definitional debate, but yes, like we focus on, probably mid 60s through late 80s mostly.
One of the characteristics of that time that was revealed to me that I didn't fully connect was the availability of pornography. You used to have to go to a movie theater to watch porn. So that's correct, right? I mean, obviously we didn't have the internet. People didn't have VCRs. So the only way to consume it would have been to go to a theater, or I guess there were 16 millimeter film or something.
Yeah, I was just gonna say some like a lot of things you'll hear from some of the male porn stars, especially, were like, yeah, my dad had an 8 millimeter projector, and I would go downstairs and I'd find these things he bought under the counter, and that was their first exposure to porn. So you could get it, but it was obviously way more difficult. It hadn't been, normalized through VCR or anything like that.
So that means that someone getting into porn then is a completely different intention and experience than you are now, because a lot of these people, they didn't think that anyone was going to see it, and a lot of them hadn't even seen their own porn because they would go to the opening. I guess they would have openings at the movie theater,
Premieres.
a premiere rather, and they wouldn't even go in, so they didn't, it just was not something that they were expecting people to know about or their family to hear about or to see. Is my understanding accurate?
Yeah, I think it's fairly accurate. I would say the one exception was that there was a lot of crossover between films and magazines. So especially on both sexes side, I guess you'd hear about how people were going out on film photography shoots, and so those magazines I think were a lot more accessible. So we've heard a lot of stories from people about like their family like finding out when like a colleague would hand a magazine over to them and be like, hey, isn't this your daughter or something. So
Yeah.
there was a little bit more exposure, but yeah, for film, I think one of the themes we hear a lot is not maybe that at the time they didn't expect a lot of people to see it, although that was part of it. Like, hey, it's going to be whoever walks into a porn theater. But I think it was more the idea of because it was film, it's not digital, it's not tape, it was literally film. The idea, like film was not thought to last. I think it was like this stuff will like degrade and disappear. So one of the more surprising things for people who were especially in the much earlier days, like the 60s and 70s, is the fact that like their films, quote unquote, wound up on DVDs and now on streaming sites and all that stuff. And they were just like, didn't expect that to happen.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That sounds like that might be surprising for them.
Surprise. I think one of the other things that's interesting for me is like sometimes we'll like when we first started this, I think a lot of the big names that were more out there, it's sort of we talk to them, they're easy to find, and they're more owning their past. For me personally, some of the more interesting conversations we have are with people who, are not out there. And so we really have to track them down. And sometimes those people have big fan followings now and they have no idea. Like they don't go back and look at themselves, even with the internet, which is shocking to me. Some of them are like, wait, there are like fan sites for me and groups for me, and they're just like scratching their heads about it. And it's like, that is such an interesting disconnect. Like,
Are you speaking of Helga?
but I mean, she's one of them, but she's not alone. Helga's she's really of an older generation. So she was like the mom even in the early days. So she's a unique character, but like a lot of them, who really kind of went on and moved on in their life. Like again, literally for some of these people, it was like, yeah, I made like they shot a good few times, but like a lot of times they would shoot and all that footage would wind up in different places. So what they may have had like 8 shoots or something like that, and it would propagate into say like 20 films or something like that. And so they have no idea. It was such a small thing for them. So the idea, the legs that this thing's had over time is fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the nature of. I'm obviously not like I have nothing to do with television or film and what I do for a living, but I get that feeling. I watch these interviews of people that were on like the Brady Bunch, and I kind of get that feeling where like, yeah, we kind of did it for 5 summers when we were kids, and now it's kind of out there, and we're sort of being dragged back into it, and yeah, we'll kind of. I'll join the conversation to make the money, but it is sort of weird that like technology has taken a experience that was something that they did, for a limited period of time, and it's turned into something that just won't go away.
Exactly. And imagine if like Marsha Brady did anal, right? So it's like just
Yeah.
multiply that sort of shock by X%.
I think that might have to be the key quote that I use in promoting this. Imagine if Marsha Brady
Marsha
did
Brady
anal.
did anal. I'm sure there's a parody out there. There's a like the porn parodies are my favorite. So
So do you think that when these films were being made, because the one thing I have not done is I have not watched films from like beginning to end to understand the creative component, the story, etc. Is that something that was part of this when these films were being made, more of a creative energy that was put into it and thoughtfulness?
it depends on who you talk to, but I'd say from the early director's point of view, absolutely. They were in New York, they wanted to get into film. There was no industry here, and the way you could get money was through sex films. And so they were just really interested in the craft of film. And so they really tried, to create real, works within very limited confines. I think I can't remember who said it, but one of the directors said to me, like, yeah, you could do anything with $100,000 budget back in those days, but imagine if you had 5,000. Like that's why I'm a craftsman and those people weren't, because I had to create with such constraints. Um, and I think, what's interesting in the performers is there's a real mixed bag. Like a lot of them were trying to break into acting. And so they would pick up the sex work, maybe not so much because that's the way they would get into acting, but because they could perform, they did sort of consider it performance and they could bring something to it and then it would give them money. But, other people did it just for money or, sometimes, especially on the men's side, like it was for sex. It was
Yeah.
just, so it's like a very large variety. But a lot of people did try to create something real there, whether it was from like the story and the production to the performance they would bring. They really wanted to be, creative crafts people. And some of the famous people like of the time would like Woody Allen's crews when they weren't shooting his films would work on sex films and, stuff like that. Like you would have a lot of or not a lot of, but some crossover.
Yeah, I did hear that. That was surprising to me. A lot of people that you interviewed mentioned that people were working day jobs, working on legit films or whatever they were called, and then they would work a night job doing the porn. So, were there any successful transitions of people that were using adult films as a way to express and develop their creativity, and then eventually they got into something that was more mainstream?
Yeah, not that many. There really was a stigma, I think, that, kind of hung over you, certainly for women. So there'd be some crossover, like Andrea True you mentioned, she went from porn to Queen of Pop, and um, there were definitely other exceptions. Behind the camera, I think you found more people who would cross over, like cinematographers or, certain directors. They were able to move into other industries. And, some of them are willing to talk about that now, and some of them not. Some people that we've wanted to go after who are really critical. I mean, not big names, so it's not like I'm trying to hide something from your audience, but they've just sort of arm length to the past because even to this day, they might be worried about the impact on their career, or sometimes because there was some shadiness in the business dealings around these films, that some people are still frightened for their safety, which I find funny. But, if you're that frightened, I think it sticks with you.
Okay. So one of the things that you mentioned that you like, or the types of interviews that you like the most, are ones where you're telling a story. And I think you said that you consider yourself a storyteller. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I aspire to be a storyteller. So I'm sure, like a lot of creative people who come on, or creative quote unquote, it's like it's hard to own your creativity and feel like, I am a storyteller, filmmaker, but that's what I like to do. The thing that impacts me most personally are deep, like personal stories, or personal, intimate, I'll say, not personal, but and so since I respond to that so much, I like to try to create that. And so, we work in a lot of media. We started with film, we moved to podcasts. We love writing. So a lot of my favorite things that are on the rialtoreport.com are written pieces. Some of those are have been optioned now for film. So hopefully someday they'll be made into
Whoa,
action.
really? Wow, that's exciting.
It is, I'm always like, I'm Debbie Downer, because I'm like, it'll be exciting if it ever gets made, but it's nice to know that it has a shot. It's closer than it was when it was just sitting on our site. Um, but yeah, it's really trying to figure out how to creatively tell a story that's going to resonate with people, which I guess is at the core of any creative endeavor. I
Yeah.
bet your audience is like, finally, they're going to talk about creativity. Why are they talking about sex so much? Like, sex is creative. But yeah, so it's really, trying to just create something that people would have an emotional response to, right? And that might linger with them at least a little bit in this world of, you know, getting bombarded with media, 24/7 and 15-second sound bites. So that's the aspiration.
Cool. Now, have you always, is this something that you had as a child, that you were creative, or that you wanted to see yourself as a storyteller?
No, not at all. Like I think for a long time I was one of those people, like I loved to go to music shows but never thought I could be a musician. I would love to watch films but never thought I could be a filmmaker, and just sort of thought I would be on the receiving end of that,
Okay.
and had this mental block about it. And so the one thing I would say for people who are listening to your podcast to try to figure out like how to do it, it's just like just do it. It's like if it interests you at all, like don't worry about not being good enough, or not sort of creating something new. It's like you just have to roll up your sleeves and start trying. Like I mean, across life I'm a total 99% perspiration person.
Yeah.
I just really believe that you just work, 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 and there's always going to be people who are better and whatever it might be. But if you can just look to yourself and say, am I getting better at creating something that I can feel good about, that one person out there might connect to? I think that's pretty powerful.
I would completely agree with that. I always use the correlation or mapping this to snowboarding. Because
Huh.
if you want to learn how to snowboard, it's always going to suck when you first start. But the only way to learn how to snowboard is you have to just do it, and eventually it will get easier, and eventually you'll be able to snowboard. And I think, particularly with creative endeavors, because I feel like there's so many people that I talk to that are saying, I want to do this that's creative, but there's always a fear of starting. There's something that's just holding them back. And in your suggestion of just doing it, I think is so important.
Totally. And like, if you're like any normal person, you're going to think it sucks in the beginning, but don't be discouraged because everybody feels that way. It's like we all think that it's crappy. And so like, I, one cheat, quote unquote, that might help some people is like look to people that you admire, right? So I love writing. And so I'll look to writers that I admire, and I won't know them by name, but I'll just be like, I'll read a piece or something and I'll say, okay, what's really resonating for me here? And I'll kind of like try to boil it down. I'll be like, okay, it's the economy of words. I really love how less is more here. And then I'll try to emulate that in my work,
Yeah.
and I feel like that can be a helpful way to start, kind of getting better. So it may feel like derivative at first and like you're, just recreating what somebody does, but it'll help build your muscle. Yeah.
Yeah. I think just staying in it,
Yeah.
just staying in it. But I feel like there's so many distractions for people these days that
Totally.
there's so many more distractions that staying with it and staying in it, it can be, I almost feel like it's more challenging currently than it was for people, whatever, I don't know, like in the 50s or 60s, where there just was not all of this outside stuff bombarding us, and YouTube and Facebook and all of this crap and Netflix, and
Yeah.
when you're doing that stuff, you're not exercising your creative muscle. You're not necessarily developing yourself creatively. You're not staying in it. I don't know. Would you agree with that?
I mean, it sounds like two parts to what you're saying. One is there more stuff today? And I would, it certainly feels like, it's, you watch everybody on the subway with their face down into their phone. Like in the old days, you would just be sort of staring out or having a book and stuff. So yes, I definitely feel like there is more ways to distract ourselves. And that's its own show about like the probably evilness of the world and trying to kind of placate the masses and keep us away from ourselves. Um, you know, but does it take you away from your creativity? I think it's a mix because like sometimes when I will watch a Netflix show, I mean, I guess I feel two things about it. Like one is sometimes I can get really inspired by something I see
Yeah.
produced by somebody else and it can give me an idea. So, I know you're not saying, never watch a show or whatever, but it's not an either or for me.
Mm-hmm.
And also like I think I like the difference between Ashley, my partner, and myself in this endeavor is like he has such a tremendous work ethic. Like he will, work a full day at his corporate job and then like come home, like grab something fast to eat and like sit for 4 hours heads down on creating content. And I don't have that discipline. So, I'll work a full day. I'll be tired. I'll come home. Maybe I'll work out. I'll grab something to eat. I'll have a glass of wine and then I just want to veg out. Like I just don't. So it's for me it's like it's partly that there's more distractions that make it easier for me to kind of lean into my lesser angels. And partly just my nature, which is not like I love to just like sit on a sofa and read a magazine and then like fall asleep with it on my face. So I think, like that probably for me is one of the harder things
Yeah.
personally from a creative perspective. To your point, like I do think like the more you work the muscle, the better that you'll be. Like, so if anybody's listening to this, like looking for tips, I feel like if you are one of those people who can kind of force yourself to focus, like just say, listen, I will just say like, you know, on the weekend, until noon when I get up, like I will not let myself do anything but write or paint or sketch or whatever it is that you want to do, and you can stick to that, that's probably the best thing. Because I always think about the stat they say about attention switching and how it completely takes you out of flow. And, so it's like if you're sitting there and you're trying to write and then your phone beeps and you pick up the message and you text your friend back and you put it down, you're like, oh, that only took a second. But it takes your brain a lot to reorient to what you were doing and get back into that state. So try to block out the noises. And like I'm saying this to myself more than anybody else, like that's the constant battle.
Yeah, no, and I would agree with that. Like, I think multitasking is just ridiculous, and it doesn't work for me. I can really do one thing effectively at once, and like because interruptions, like you said, can just are very distracting. I know one thing specifically I do is when I'm painting, sometimes I don't even bring my phone.
Yeah.
I just don't even bring it.
Do you set goals? Yeah, like do you say to yourself, like, I'm not going to leave until I've like gotten the base layer of this painting established, or like
I do.
you do?
Well, I sometimes, it depends on what's going on. If I have an installation that requires like 10 paintings, I create a schedule. And I know exactly, because there's a flow for the painting. Like the base layer, the underpainting, the first layer, etc. So I will set up a schedule and I try to adhere to it. The reality is with the painting, it's not like being a project manager where I can just force myself through it. Some days it's just not going to work. Like it's not there. And I have to move on to something else. So even though I plan to do the first layer of paint on Tuesday and Wednesday, I can get halfway into Tuesday and be like, yeah, this isn't going to happen today. And I have to move on to something else. So I definitely do try to use that part of my brain that has been trained over the years as a project manager. And it definitely helps to structure things.
Do you like, is there any common denominator to the days that don't work for you? Like, is there anything that's going to predict a bad day for you?
The fact that I haven't been painting in a while. So if I take a break, it is really, really hard. It just takes a while to get up to speed again. It takes days and days and days. But once I get going, I'm okay. But it's really weird. So if I'm restarting after taking a couple of weeks off, I'll go to the studio and I'm like, Rick, you got to stay as long as you can. And then I hit that wall and I'm like, okay, I'm done. And then next day I just have to force myself to try to make it last longer. And then eventually I will get up to a spot where it's at a productive level.
And is it the same when you write?
Actually, writing is probably easier for me. I would say that, yeah, it's probably a similar setup, a similar scenario, but I would say that I could probably turn that on and off quicker.
Interesting. Like the thing that kills me, like for people who are like we're saying just do it and get into it, like the one thing I'll say is when I'm in the zone, nothing feels better, right? Like so when I'm writing and it's flowing and like I get so excited by the story and stuff, and yet the like a couple of hours later I'll just be like, yeah, or I could sit back on the couch now and like watch a show or go meet a friend for a drink or whatever. Like that's the thing that kills me about myself. And like, so the one thing I try to remind myself, and again, I keep thinking like, what are tips to give people for how they can really tap into it is like, try to stay in touch with how good it feels when you hit that flow. Cause it's really satisfying.
It's very satisfying. And I would say that I tell people that it can be like bipolar because when you create something, when something comes out of you that you created and people receive it and they connect with it, it is the best feeling, as I'm sure you know, because it's so personal and it's a experience and I wouldn't say joy is the word, but it just stimulates something inside of you that I never got in a corporate job. Like even when I had like a big successful project, it never felt as satisfying as when something that I created myself is received by someone in a way that I wanted. On the flip side, when it fails, it can be really devastating.
Do you find like, because I find, I mean, I guess there's like abject failures, but like, things that are good, like they're going to resonate with some people, but there'll always be some people it doesn't resonate with. And then
Sure.
same thing, like, even when things don't resonate, there'll be a few people who do. So it's like, it's very easy to, I think, get yourself in that mindset of like, it sucks, it sucks, it sucks. Because it's, just like we go to Twitter and we look at the bad things, about stuff instead of being like, oh, look at this uplifting thing. Like that's another kind of thing to not. I think it's just like whatever you need to do for yourself not to get discouraged. Like whatever's going to make you go back the next day and do it again. Because when it does feel good, like it feels good, and it will, like, and finding that satisfaction for yourself, which is like interesting. So bringing it back to adult film, like we'll meet a lot of people, and once they realize that there's some interest in this, they're like, oh, I should tell my life story, so you'll get a lot of people who are back from the industry who should tell it. And I always ask them like, why do you want to tell it? Because like if you want to tell it to make money, like it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Harry Reams, one of like the biggest names in the industry, like the advance gets, like for his book was very small, like it's just not going to happen. But if you want to do it for yourself because you just want to tell that story. Like we have just finished helping another sort of exploitation filmmaker write his biography. And like I think for him, he's just like, listen, even if like two people pick it up, like I would be thrilled. Like he just wanted to have his story out there. So it's like the same thing when we create ourselves, sort of try to find the thing in yourself that's gonna motivate versus like anything in our lives being guided just by external validation or whatever, especially in the creative realm, because like there's always going to be people who hate your shit.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely.
That's a depressing ending statement.
No, but it's true. I mean, but it's just something that you have. I mean, but that's kind of just being a person on Earth. There's always going to
Yeah.
be people that like you, people that don't like you, people that respond to you just being yourself. You're always told just be yourself. Well, sometimes if you're just being yourself, people don't like you.
Right.
And that's just what it's like, being a person. So I think
Right.
there's some of it that's just being an adult and realizing that. But I think that when you're producing something from the creative part of you, I think that it can be, I think you're a little bit more vulnerable.
So are you one of those people who think like everybody's creative and it's just finding your outlet?
No, I don't think that at all. I don't.
Interesting.
I think that, I think there's definitely well, I mean, I went to college for engineering, so that is not creative. And the people that,
Really? I find that
well,
so creative.
Well, I think that I have an undergrad in engineering. So I think if I did graduate studies, it probably would have been different because graduate studies is, engineering is using like science to solve problems. We weren't necessarily in undergrad solving problems. We were just kind of learning the foundations of, chemistry, physics, calculus. I studied plastics engineering. So we studied the fundamentals of plastic processing, all this boring stuff. But it wasn't necessarily about learning how to solve, in my experience in where I went to school, about really how to solve problems or how to create something new. Now, I think that if I got a master's or a PhD, that's probably what would have happened. It would have been like taking these foundations and using and being trained to solve problems. So I guess my point to answer your question, I think a lot of the people that I went remembering back then, so many years ago, I don't necessarily think of those folks as creative. Now, maybe it's because we were in an environment where they weren't tasked to do it. They weren't being pressed to be creative. So do you
Yeah.
think that everyone has a creative part of them?
I do. Like I think I do. I think, well, it depends, I guess, how you define creative, right? But like I think all of us have a ability to create. I think some of us are more talented than others. I'm never going to be born to dance like, Fred Astaire, whatever it might be. But I think you know, I guess part of it is like in my mind, I'm like, I'm sure there's one thing in the world that like I'm really pretty good at, but like what if I never do that one thing? Like what if like I would have been a champion table tennis player, but like I've never done it and that's it. And I think I feel that way about people in general. Like all of us have an ability to be creative. And it's just like, do you want to tap into that and like push into that and kind of find what that is? But I'm sure that's offensive to some artists and, artists in the kind of general term, who feel like, no, there's something here. So I don't feel like everybody's going to hang in the Louvre or anything, you know what I mean? But I just think if it's just about creating something that you might call artistic or whatever, like again, it's about just doing it and figuring out why you're doing it. If you're doing it just for yourself to kind of put it out there, like get a hook rug, like crochet. I don't care what you do, but like just do it because there's such satisfaction in the process. And if you don't like it, if you don't find that satisfaction, it's not for you. Try something else or whatever. So I have a very annoying broad definition, but not like you get a gold star for just coming to school. Like, as a kid, it's like, come to school. Everybody should come to school. You're not going to get a gold star for it. Only a few people are going to get gold stars and like hang in the Louvre, but try.
Okay, I think that is good guidance and advice.
I like that answer. It's like, we will agree to disagree. I love it.
No, I do. No, I think that, because I think that most people have the capability to be creative. I guess my example about being in engineering is I felt like that was a period in my life where I was with people that, like a subset of people that I didn't necessarily think of as creative, but in most everyday life, I would agree with you. One thing that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting is like, I think you were saying something about you could be a champion ping pong player or, they could, and I always think about new industries that are created that have internet technology, like all, because you and I used to work in that industry together, and there were so many people that were extremely talented and creative, not like visual designers, but just creative way they solved business problems, etc. And I always wonder if that industry wasn't created, that kind of tapped into something for them. They could have gone into may not have been able to see their potential of what kind of creative person they could have been.
Maybe, but like who knows what else it would have been, I guess. Because like even to your point of your schoolmates, like that context didn't sound like one that unleashed creativity. You were probably being lectured at and stuff like that. But these people who are sitting around you who you don't get a chance to see it, like I wonder if in a different context, if somebody brought them in and, put them in front of clay and said, let's like sculpt like Rodin, like what would have happened? You know what I mean? So it's like being given permission or giving yourself permission to try to explore, and I think that that's part of it. Just, for creativity, I think it's just like really kind of listen to yourself and figure out what gets you going. It's not to look at it and be like, I should be a painter or I should play guitar or whatever. Yep. It's not like, it's like, do you listen to somebody playing guitar and just like get transported by that, then pick up a guitar and try it. It's about finding that thing, I think, that really interests you for yourself and cultivating it.
What are your thoughts on the availability of porn today?
Like, I think the question of, does pornography really distort your ideas of sexuality, or does it unleash something is a very compelling question, right? Because I think even back in the old days, it would have been like that, right? Like it's the difference between objectifying somebody and treating them more like a subject and trying to connect to them. Like anything that diminishes people, right? Or sort of takes the humanity out of them so that you can look at it is going to be fraught, I guess, meaning you can take that to bad places, right? Like
Yeah.
you can look at porn and completely objectify somebody in my mind and like, have a great orgasm or something, but that doesn't mean like you're going to objectify them always. Like if you are more of a healthy person, hopefully that just fits into a well-rounded thing. But I feel like, for nowadays, it's like you get the worst of both worlds because you get all this access and this weirdness, and then like, there's like less education in schools, and it's more puritanical. It's like if you don't talk about it and contextualize it, then I think there's going to be risk to it, as with anything.
But I mean, but let's be real. You can't talk and contextualize porn to a 14-year-old boy who can watch it on his iPhone. Like, I can't imagine if I had access to gay porn when I was a teenager on my phone. Like, I can't even imagine. I never would have left my room. Honestly,
Right.
like, what would that have
Right.
done? What would that have done to me?
Well, I feel like every 14-year-old boy with or without it did it, but like I guess it really depends. Like I feel like we're gonna end with like parents talk to your kids, but I feel like if somebody like the thing for me that I remember and like I love my parents, God bless them, but like, we were not having open and honest conversations about like sex and love and emotion and like like when I was a kid, they gave me What's Happening to Me as the book, and then like we sort of didn't talk about it, and there was a little sex education in there. Like if somebody had said to me as a 14-year-old girl who also had hormones raging and stuff and was trying to figure it out, somebody just like talked to me more about sex or like pointed me more to books that talk about sex and like said to me like, what's happening in your body right now, let me explain the chemistry of what's happening and why it feels the way it does and what probably is going to, it would at least give me a little bit more I feel like hopefully at that point you'd have a little more maturity to be able to take that in and help you balance out that amazing porn that you're going to be watching the other 23 hours of the day. You know what I mean? So it's like, I think that's all I would say is like somebody who like, it's the same thing with guns or whatever, but obviously not to the same degree. But like, if you just sort of watch NRA TV and like give somebody a gun and whatever, and then you don't talk to them about the larger context that guns live in the world, it's going to be very easy to have one view of it. So I'm just a big fan of giving like as much information as is appropriate for somebody at the time, which is a big question because like our brain, sometimes we're not ready to take on certain things, but like not underestimating people's ability to take in more context and like really trying to do that, so at least we make better informed decisions as we're sitting there consuming that porn on our phone.
Right. Okay.
So unhelpful. And that's why I'm not a parent. There you go.
And that's another key quote from this interview. And that's why I'm not a parent.
Exactly. Because I could not guide a young person for anything.
One of the people that you interviewed, name was Jennifer Wells, and I believe it was her that she talked about her treatment in the industry was always about respect and no one ever treated her inappropriately. But when she tried to do legitimate films, she said that was constantly happening, where she would be propositioned to, engage in sexual behavior with directors or whatever in order to move her career forward, and she actually did not pursue the legitimate paths, and she ended up just sticking with the porn because of treatment. And this just made me and that was kind of something that I didn't really hear of a lot of mistreatment from the women. And then I think of like this Harvey Weinstein guy, how like all of these actresses are just being treated completely inappropriately. And I found it fascinating that in the porn industry, it really didn't seem to be happening.
Yeah, and I'm sure again there are corners where you're going to find stuff like that. But first of all, like if you're going to be having the sex, you maybe don't need to lead with the sex. Like they were going to be having the sex anyway, even with like some of the directors would have sex with the performers and stuff like that. So I always like I agree, like Jennifer was not the only person who said that. We heard that from a lot of people, and who said not just because they were porn stars, meaning like they were known for porn and so they would go in and get solicited, but that they were trying to break into the business before porn, and they were getting the casting couch all the time. And then when they were like, oh, well, I might as well do porn, like that didn't happen to them. It was definitely something that we heard quite a bit. That said, like, the one thing I also don't want people to walk away from the, Rialto Report, this sort of oral history project that we do, is thinking it was all rosy, So it's like, it wasn't all terrible. It wasn't all rosy. It was a spectrum, right? And all we're trying to do is continue to get underneath that to understand all the nuance, in today's world, like to your point with porn and stuff like that, like, or even politics. Like, think about politics. Like, there's no room for nuance. Nobody wants to go into any complexity or gray area, but like creativity, like there's a lot of beauty that happens in the shadows. And so, that, I know that feels like a long answer to what you were saying, but like, yes, it's true. Like, yes, we've heard more positive than negative, but it isn't all roses. And, we're constantly on the lookout to see that we're not painting a superficial picture.
And I think that you succeeded. I am so pleased that I got to do all of this research and get to listen to your podcast. I've been, as I mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned earlier, I've been telling everyone about your podcast. I just think it's so well done. It's extremely thoughtful and just really high quality. And I'm really excited that I got to have this conversation with you today.
Oh, thanks. I feel the same. And I'm so glad that you're painting and writing and not just project managing, because you're just this full, wonderful person, and I can see it in your work. And I'm glad we're getting to experience some of that.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. So where can people find the Rialto Report?
So you can always go to our website, which is therialtoreport.com, and that's RIALTO report.com. And that's where you'll find not just the podcast, but, the written pieces. We have photo essays, things like that. Or on any podcatching app, you'll find the Rialto Report.
Okay, great. Thank you. This was awesome. My name is Ricky McGuckran, and you have been listening to Eager to Know, the podcast. If you haven't already, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join me next week for another Eager to Know podcast.